In this lesson, we'll explore linking parameters as it pertains to toolpaths and how it impacts the motion of your toolpaths. Currently, I have a machine set up in this part and I have stock defined. You'll see the stock is defined by the red shape around the part, and the origin of this part is in the upper corner. So this corner is where my XYZ zeros are all located. Now if I move this part over to the side and go into my contour toolpath, I'm just going to select this chain right here. The fact that I'm selecting this chain at this location in a 3D model is very important, because when I go into my parameters page, and again, we're going to go through these parameters in great detail in future lessons. For now, we're just going to go right to linking parameters. This is where you control the depth of your toolpath. The depth option has absolute, incremental, and associative. Incremental means that it's relative to the geometry that I chained. So since I chained the bottom of this boss here, I will be cutting 0 inches relative to that. So I'll be cutting right on that, and not any deeper and not any higher. If, for example, I typed in minus 0.1 here, I'd be going negative 0.1 inches below that geometry. The other option I could do is just say absolute. And if I don't know the depth of this line relative to my origin, I could just say absolute, select depth, and pick the point I want to go to. Now I notice I'm at minus 0.49. So this is actually the same as saying incremental 0. Because again, incremental is relative to the chained geometry. Absolute is relative to my Z0. The other option we have here is associative. If I wanted to, I could turn on associative and physically pick a point, like that point, or even that point, which obviously would be the same depth. The reason we would do that is because if this point moves, let's say we use a model prep functionality and drag that point down a couple thousandths, it will still be 0 relative to that associative point. Top of stock is also relative to depth if you have it set to incremental. So if we have depth set to 0 incremental, we'll be cutting right there. Let's just preview the toolpath, and you'll see that the toolpath feeds in, then arcs into the part, cuts it, and then arcs off. And this curve is our lead in, lead out, which we'll get into later. Notice it feeds in from the top of the stock. That's because the top of stock is defined as 0 absolute. In other words, it's set to this Z value. If I said incremental, I could say 0.75 incremental, which is 0.75 inches above my depth. So if I hit preview now, see how this value changed, because now I'm feeding in from a much higher distance. Feed plane and retract are relative to your top of stock. So whatever my top of stock is, my feed plane would be 0.2 incremental above that, and my retract would be 0.25 incremental above my top of stock. Now, unless we wanted to choose everything to be absolute, we could say my depth is here, my top of stock is right there, and my feed plane is a 1/4 inch above that, and then my retract is another 1/4 inch above that, or 1/2 inch above top of stock. And if I preview this, you'll see now this is what we get. So the tool comes in, rapids down, and then feeds down, cuts, and then rapids back. And that's all because of these values. So in summary, incremental is relative to the geometry that you selected. Top of stock, if you choose incremental, it's also relative to the depth. Your retract and your feed plane, if these values are set to incremental, they're all relative to the top of your stock. And the reason this is important is because imagine if this area right here was already machined, and then you wanted to machine this area. Well, let's do that right now. We have all this extra material up here that's no longer going to exist, so we can modify our toolpaths. So let's go in. I'm going to create another contour toolpath, but it's going to be this edge to that edge, and that's all it's going to be. And before I click OK, please note that let's assume all of this material is gone. So I'm not going to feed from way up here down into this part because there's no material here. I can wrap it down. So I'm going to adjust my top of stock. So in my linking parameters, my depth will be 0 incremental. It's relative to this geometry that I selected. And my top of stock will be incremental, but specifically, it's not going to be this geometry or this geometry, which of course is the same. It's going to be this depth. So as you can see now, it's 0.7 above my geometry that I chained, which was down here. And then my feed plane would be 1/4 inch above that, and my retract would be 1/2 inch above that. So if we preview this toolpath, notice now I'm not feeding all the way down into the air. I'm wrapping right down into just a little bit above the material, and then I'm feeding down. So that's how you can make your toolpaths very efficient, is by using incremental and absolute accordingly.